Good evening. I'd like to explain my work as a psychosexual consultant. Quite simply, I'm someone people turn to with their emotional, psychological, sexual, and sometimes even moral inquiries. Now, over the last 20 years, I have noticed a remarkable shift in both attitude and behavior amongst a very small, select group of men in this country. Now, these men have spent an enormous amount of time and energy trying to change themselves. In a sense, they have reconstructed their whole way of being. Now, to understand the term reconstruction, I'd like to look at a 20-year period between 1970 and 1990. I find a good analogy is if you can try and imagine a man as a large, run-down inner-city house. Now, in 1970, the last tenants moved out and it looked like the end. The house would remain empty forever. A cold wind blew through the gaps in the brickwork. Then, politically motivated squatters moved in and formed a commune. They did some low-level maintenance, they painted the walls bright colours, but fundamentally they left the structure of the house, stroke man, untouched. By late 1979, a dentist had bought the house. He kept the empty flower boxes and the Atomcraft 9 Danker stickers in the window. He hung some non-exploitative Afghan curtains, and he lined the walls with a truly phenomenal collection of books by women writers. Now, this house was really trying hard. Particular attention was paid to the bathroom, but above all, this house gave good kitchen. Now, as time passed, taste changed. The decorative layers added with such care in the 70s were peeled back in the 80s to reveal the raw brickwork and the stripped wood floors. The house was lean, mean, and moody looking. In many ways, more attractive than its 70s image. Although there was a school of thought which claimed what it had made up for in style, it had lost in soul. However, if you were choosing this house, you would never complete the sale without taking a look inside. You'd want to know if the interior of the house, stroke man, had been reconstructed. You'd want to know if he had a reconstructed heart. Now, one of the reasons for the interest in the changing behavior of males has come about from the release of some recent research. Now, we can see here on this graph the availability of emotionally aware male partners from 1690 until 1990. As you can see from the results of extensive research, the levels have remained consistently low. Before we look in detail at reconstructed men, I'd like to point out the differences between him and what is commonly referred to as a normal man. Now, the very act of putting the words normal and man in the same sentence is, of course, a dangerous generalization. However, it is a commonly used term, the word normal coming from the French Norman, meaning a warring peasant, someone who has lorded it over the Anglo-Saxons for 1,000 years and still consider themselves a superior class. The normal man cannot express his caring or loving emotions and is only too willing to display his more violent ones. All emotional communication between males is done in a strictly coded language. For example, if one man feels a strong bond of friendship for another, he will express his feelings by calling his friend a series of offensive names and slapping him repeatedly around the shoulder and back area. Now, it is impossible, even in the most ordered of male lives, to deny the existence of strong emotional feelings. We all have them, but the normal man really doesn't like them. In fact, he'll do anything to avoid them by channeling that energy into other areas. Fishing, heavy drinking, model railways, frenetic masturbation and unprovoked violence being amongst the most popular. Now, to define what a reconstructed man is and the differences between him and a normal man, I'd like to look at 5 key areas. Blame, the psychofocal conceit, testosterone, guilt, and the sensual self-image. I'll start with blame. Now, first, I'd like to look at how blame is manipulated. A member of my study group, John Blake, a biochemist from Essex, told me the tale of how he was in a pub one evening with a group of people he'd only just met. He takes up the story.
So, to break the ice, I thought I'd tell them the joke about the Arab, the fat nun, and the rhinoceros. Anyway, I laughed a lot. But some of the ladies present didn't think it was very funny. One of them said it was offensive. I said, look, love, if you want to hear some really offensive humour, you should go to one of them working men's clubs up north.
Now, let us break down this statement and look at it in detail. John was unable to accept the blame for the offensive joke, so he attempted to shift it by referring to something he felt would be seen to be more offensive. Now, this is called blame realignment, and it's a very common, normal male practice, as we can see in this diagram. Now, here we can see the blame, or the problems, coming in from the top, are instead of being accepted and dealt with internally by the normal man, are being redirected towards a series of target groups. Statistically, we've been able to prove that women, homosexuals and Irish people are by far the most popular targets. And now, during his interview, John Blake gave me an example of blame realignment on a slightly more dramatic level.
I was driving to work one morning, straining over the back to find my lunchbox that the wife packs for me every day. Something went wrong. It must have been the rack and pinion, because the car just ploughed straight into the bus stop and killed a few people. So I stopped, and I got out, and all these people were looking at me. I said, don't look at me. If my wife had put the sandwiches where I told her, none of this would have happened. Anyway, it's a stupid place to put a bus stop. They should sue the council.
Now, this was an interesting case, as it highlights the normal male belief that whatever goes wrong, it is always someone else's fault. The normal man sees the rest of the world as a huge mass of incapable people stumbling around in a daze. He sees all problems as coming from outside, from other people. Now, research done in the 1920s in the United States showed how we are all born with the same basic psychological assumption that we alone are the very center of the universe. Now, this was called a psychofocal conceit, or a PFC, and it manifests itself in perpetual selfishness, the ability to demand without guilt. Now, it's an essential part of our early upbringing. The condition normally disappears as the person matures. In female children, it was discovered the child no longer held the assumption by the time she reached the age of 9 or 10. In males, however, there were still cases of PFCs in men of 40 and 50 years of age. Now, we can see here in this diagram the results of recent research on the subject. As we can clearly see, the reconstructed man has worked through his own PFC level to such an extent he is approaching a Zen state of ego loss. Women generally achieve a healthy balance there, and normal men achieve a reading for which a psychological term has not yet been devised. John Blake had a rather revealing anecdote to tell on this very subject.
So she comes home soaking wet and asked me why I hadn't picked her up. Well, I told her I'd forgotten. Oh, no, that's not good enough for her. I said, moan, moan, moan. You know, as a little joke. No, she just stood there, dripping. She'd completely forgotten I couldn't take the sodding car out in the heavy rain because I'd only just washed it.
Again, we see an example of how the world is viewed from a very isolated point. Now, testosterone was first discovered in 1908 by Professor Bernard Heilemann, who worked for an international chemical company in Basel, Switzerland. Since then, terms like testy and tetchy have come into common usage to describe men who punch holes through walls when they don't get their own way. The existence of testosterone is often used to support the argument that men behave violently because of their hormones and not their environment. Well, a member of my study group, I'll call him Mickey, I don't want to use his real name as he is a dangerous psychotic criminal and he knows where I live, had just finished serving a 3-year prison sentence when he told me this.
I went bald very young, so I loved punching blokes who still had their own hair. I was in and out of Nick for years. The doctor said I was violent because of my testosterone levels. So I nutted the bastard. A bit like you, had all his own hair. Now when I get arrested, I just tell the bill I can't help it. Because of my testosterone, they send me straight back to see you.
Testosterone is not only used as an excuse for violent male behavior. In the late 70s, it was discovered that the levels of testosterone in the male body fluctuate according to a man's natural monthly cycle. Now, most men were completely unaware of this taking place. However, these so-called non-sexist men of the period claimed to be aware of their fluctuating monthly cycles. This new awareness came about after an article on the subject appeared on the Guardian Women's page in September 1978. We can see in this diagram that there was a marked increase at about that time in the perceived levels of testosterone in the male body. Now, this new awareness manifested itself in many different ways. Some men found that they felt more irritable, more horny, or more boring at certain times of the month. Other men found there were times when they simply could not do the washing up. And the vast majority discovered that there were times when they really needed to indulge in sex with many different women in order to help them balance out their testosterone. Guilt was only introduced on a truly popular level after the Second World War. The post-war Labour Party considered introducing guilt as a compulsory subject for all children over 13, but this was later abandoned. There was even a chair of guilt studies created at Telford Polytechnic in 1959. The incumbent, Professor Douglas Johnson, was the only man we know of who officially died of guilt. Now, as far as we know, he lived an utterly blameless life. He loved his wife and children very much. He was a vegetarian, and he became a tireless charity worker. His last words were, "I'm sorry I'm taking so long to die." Now, this graph, which was created by Professor Johnson, was intended to show the fluctuating levels of guilt in the male over the last 20 years. Unfortunately, Professor Johnson felt it would be too judgmental to actually apply the data, and so he left it blank. One other area I'd like to look at briefly is the sensual self-image. Now, recent research from Denmark has shown that the internal picture we create of ourselves through our nerve endings, our sensuality, if you like, is very different to the way that we see ourselves and each other visually. Now, this representation is the sensual self-image of a reconstructed man. Now, as you can see, it's a very clean, open and non-threatening body, very large eyes and ears to take in what a woman has to say, long, sensitive fingers, and a perpetually erect penis already fitted with a condom. Whereas here we see a rather different picture emerging. Now, this is the sensual self-image of a normal man. As you can see, the large lips and tongue to eat, drink, and perform lewd oral acts, the giant grabbing hands to grab, and the roll of carpet-style penis all point to an emotionally undeveloped sense of self. I'd like now to briefly look at the history of the development of the reconstructed man over the last 20 years. As the 1970s dawned, a whole new generation of men were waking up to realize that just possibly they hadn't always been right about everything. Many men went through a period of soul-searching around this time. The poetry of the era can tell us something of the mood. Here's an example.
Hear my heart, it beats the same as yours. Though my body is hard, my feelings are soft. I am no warrior, I return only from toil. I need care as much as you need it. I'm quite nice.
In fact, I wrote that myself at the age of 19. Well, the response from the women's movement was fairly hostile. It was as though men thought they could do the washing up, learn to cry, write a bit of a poem, and the sins and torment of 5,000 years of patriarchal oppression would be washed away in a moment. However, some more radical male groupings attempted to challenge these assumptions in the early 70s. They were called men's groups, and they flowered from March 1971 until late June 1982. The 80s put a stop to any form of soul-searching, and as anyone in marketing will tell you, men's groups are not seen as a particularly exciting fiscal growth area. But, as we can see in this graph, towards the late 70s, upwards of 400,000 men attended men's groups for a very limited period. By late June 1988, one man, Geoffrey Vickers, was still going to a men's group on his own in Peterborough. Then, towards the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, we had the Weekend Intensive. This would be organised by a loose affiliation of men's groups who communicated through their monthly magazine, Spare Part. The Weekend Intensive was a very specific event. There was always a range of workshops to attend. For example, at an event held in Totnes in Devon in 1981, you could attend a workshop on any of the following. From 10 a.m. until 12, I feel guilty, therefore I am. From 1 o'clock until 3, living with the biological chain of events that I call me. And from 5 o'clock until 7, from Volvo to vulva, learning to understand women. Now, these sessions were not an easy cop-out, as Gerald Milligan, a member of my study group and a facilitator of long and grinding experience, remembers.
We were doing a very good workshop on homophobia. I had a couple of men in my group crying hysterically, and I was pleased it was going so well. Then the door burst open, and Terry ran in the room. He said, please come quick. Nick is trying to cut his penis off. I can't cope. I think he needs the support of a group. So we all got up, went to the door, looked out in the hallway, and there was this naked man trying in vain to injure himself with a pair of child's paper-cutting scissors. Just one of those things you had to cope with.
Now, towards the 80s, and due to the development of a free market culture, more and more men started to engage in analysts to help them develop as individuals or sort out the appalling mess they were in. Now, we can see here the constantly increasing amounts of time men spent in analysis. And no longer did they sit in rooms together with no shoes on, having a sharing experience. Men sat in beautifully decorated rooms with a professional individual who guided them towards their destiny. Over the weeks and months of often very expensive analysis, men would attempt to reconstruct themselves. They would approach concepts such as responsibility without guilt, love without guilt, and at the very highest level, lust without guilt. Now, the assumption amongst many people is that if someone undertook such a difficult journey of rebuilding, they might very well lose some of their own self-confidence. Well, this has been proved to be very much not the case, as we can see here in this graph, which depicts the levels of self-confidence in normal men recorded over a 16-hour period, a working day. Now, he woke up down here and looked in a mirror, an experience which immediately lowered his level of self-confidence. But down here, he blamed his wife for everything, and that cheered him up a little bit. At this point here, he managed to cut very aggressively into a busy traffic jam, and that made him feel a lot happier. Here, he arrived at work and claimed to have an original idea, and he was congratulated for that. But up here, his secretary managed to prove, in fact, the idea was hers, and he was severely reprimanded. He returned home here and blamed his wife for everything, before going to the pub here and telling his friends how well he was doing at work. And of course, here is where he returned home, attempted sexual intercourse, failed, and blamed his wife. Whereas here we can see a very, very different picture emerging. The reconstructed man woke up here already feeling confident, having conducted his dreams within a positive framework formulated with his therapist. But here, he read about male violence in The Independent and felt in some way implicated in that. Then here, a woman he'd never met before smiled at him in the street, and that cheered him up. Here, he was given promotion at work without damaging anyone else's career. Here, his lover took him out for a meal. She paid for it, and he wasn't threatened by that. And over here was the start of a session of very intense and deeply satisfying safe sexual intercourse, followed by a prolonged period of mutually fulfilling pillow talk. Now, another phenomenon which pointed the way took place on the west coast of America. In May 1986, company founder Theresa May Phillips was having a dinner date with her beau, Dan Thomas Jr. As she spoke to him about her life, her children, her alcoholic ex-husband, she noticed something rather odd about Dan's behavior. He was listening to her. Now, at first, Theresa felt slightly dizzy and nauseous. She was, like women the world over, used to listening to men, not being listened to by them. She mentioned this to Dan, and he was embarrassed she'd noticed. He was finally forced to admit that it was, in fact, a simple trick he'd picked up one night in a bar. All he had to do was nod, stare at the woman, and add sporadic murmurs of consent. It was, claimed Dan, a surefire way of getting a woman into the sack. Well, Theresa had a brainwave. She would set up an escort agency with a difference. She asked Dan if he could teach other men the trick he'd shown her. He thought he could. So, from the first advert to the first million, it took a mere 6 months. Within 2 years, Man You Like was turning over $40 million annually. Now, there were tentative plans to set up a franchise in this country called Spud You Marry. But these have so far come to nothing.
Water. Now more than ever before, we need to conserve it. therefore recommend you avoid Phileas Fogg extra hot tortilla chips and stick to the cool ones, made with sour cream and aromatic spices and made in Medhamsley Road, Concert.
Oh, yeah, we've just got a new electric cooker.
Oh, yes, ceramic hob. Ceramic hob, yeah, we got that. Well, you just
very efficient.
Very efficient. You just turn it on, and within seconds, it's red. Just turn it down slightly. I mean, and
it is very
instantly
quick.
controllable.
Instant, yeah, that's a good word, instantly. Yeah.
Instantly controllable.
It is really.
And it goes bing when it's finished.
For all your creature comforts, cook electric.
Hello there. You know, sometimes photocopiers really crease me up. That's why Canon have made theirs simple enough to use, standing on your head. Just like this. So don't get a headache, get a Canon. On paper. If anyone can, Canon can.
Dirty floors are no problem with new Mr. Muscle Floor Cleaner. It wipes out grease and grime and fights germs too. And as for those greasy little marks, new Mr. Muscle Multi-Surface Polish. It cleans clean through just about everything, because Mr. Muscle loves the jobs you hate.
In the Old West, some legends will never be forgotten.
You don't look no meaner than hell, cold-blooded killer.
I ain't like that anymore. Some wrongs can never be forgiven.
Gonna kill a couple of no-good cowboys.
For what?
For cutting up a lady.
Clint Eastwood, Gene Hackman, Morgan Freeman, Richard Harris in the epic Western saga, Unforgiven.
You just shot an unarmed man.
Well, he should have armed himself.
In cinemas everywhere from Friday.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thunderbirds are go. Thunderbirds are go. Go, Thunderbirds.
Have a break. Have a Kit Kat.
Now, a question I'm often asked is, how do you spot a reconstructed man? Well, it's not quite as difficult as it might sound. You are unlikely to come across a reconstructed butcher, a soldier, arms manufacturer, taxi driver, or heavy metal musician. You are, though, likely to meet one who works in the media, the arts, local government, the social services, psychoanalysis, architecture, and, of course, graphic design. Now, he's likely to be over 30, and he will not feel guilty about anything. Now, this is the interesting phenomenon I mentioned earlier. The clinical removal of guilt through intensive psychoanalysis has resulted in a whole new form of consciousness. Donald Laycock, an architect in his early 40s, explains.
Oh, the whole guilt thing held me back for years. I now understand guilt completely. I see it as a negative currency. For instance, if I'm having an affair with another woman, I invest heavily in guilt. Now, if I tell my wife about the affair, all I'm doing is offloading that guilt onto her. I see this is very unfair, so I don't tell her.
Now, will a woman be socially embarrassed by a reconstructed man is another question that often comes up. Well, it begs another question in response. Has she already been socially embarrassed by a normal one? The answer is invariably yes. Over the centuries, women have experienced a near constant state of embarrassment due to the social blunderings of their male partners. She only needs to introduce him to her women friends, and he will immediately dominate the conversation for an hour by explaining his abilities to drive when he's very drunk. Now, a reconstructed man would be far more aware of his partner's feelings. He would not see that all his opinions would be correct at all times and in all places. He sees opinions in a far more fluid and organic way, constantly growing and changing. For example, if two couples went out to dinner and the men, normal men, noticed a young woman entering a restaurant, one might very well lean to the other and whisper something like, "Hey, cop a load of that. I could slip her a portion, no problem, chief." Now, this would cause much oppressed mirth amongst the men, the source of which would never be revealed to the women. Now, a reconstructed man would never behave in this sort of way. I asked Gerald Milligan to explain.
When I see a woman who falls into the broad category of an individual I would consider setting up a long-term partnership with, I would explain to that woman that visually I did find her very interesting, but I couldn't comment further until I knew her personally. I would then run through a long checklist. I'm looking at everything about her, you see. Balance, poise, weight-to-height ratio, hair color, complexion. I mean, to denigrate this complex process by saying, "I don't like fat chicks." A very simplistic and dated notion of my sexuality.
Now, incidentally, an interesting side issue has recently come to light, connected with these attitudes. It has been discovered that the amount of wine a woman needs to drink before she believes all men are bastards has dropped remarkably over the last 20 years. Now, this information has been put down to many different factors, all of which are probably correct. A question I'm constantly coming across is what a reconstructed man would be like as an intimate partner. Psychosexual researchers have discovered that a woman is attracted to a man for many thousands of complex and often deeply worrying reasons. In this section, I will discuss if there is any advantage in her choosing a partner who is reconstructed. For instance, he would never assume that a woman wants to have sex simply because he did. A woman would find that she would always need to initiate the love-making process. Now, this is not because he is lazy. Study group member Peter Bradshaw explains.
Historically, she's been under immense pressure to be sexually available to me. I don't want to burden women with that role, or myself with the guilt that accompanies my advances. I therefore use the theory that any woman will eventually become sexually needy if I wait in her bed long enough.
Now, if a woman finds this reticence a problem, there is an easy solution. She merely needs to describe his behavior as passionless. Now, this is almost as bad as calling a normal man penisless. Reconstructed men are very interested in passion. They have studied it in depth. Gerald Milligan again.
When she told me she thought I was passionless, I had to sit in silence and think about it for a week. People thought I was sulking, but I was just trying to work it out. I bought books about passion and decided to give it a go. I went around to her house, I threw myself at her feet, sobbed. I threatened to disembowel myself there and then because I loved her so much. She said she didn't believe me. She said it looked as though I had read a book about passion and was just trying it out. I then went to work with this Italian therapist working on voice, arm, and facial gesticulation exercises.
Now, if you've got through the initial courting period and you discover he's not a very good sexual partner, well, at least he'll be able to talk about it.
I was hopeless the first time. Couldn't achieve an erection, but I assured her that it wasn't her fault. She didn't think it was, apparently. Anyway, we spent about a week in bed together, and I finally did get an erection. Unfortunately, she was on the phone to her mother at the time, so she wasn't very interested when I showed it to her.
As we can see, even reconstructed men hobble through life carrying the wounds of our collective psychic history. The deep hole that was torn in the fabric of our national sexuality by the Victorians has only just begun to heal. Recently, men have tried to be more sensitive about themselves and their partners, but there is clearly a long and difficult journey ahead. Now, this graph was devised by the European Community Sexual Sensitivity Study Group based at Saint-Étienne in France. Surprisingly for many people, Belgium came out tops, just getting into the merely boring section. Whereas the rest of European male lovers fall under the category of dreadful, and Britain barely makes it onto the page. Statistically, though, a woman will probably find that a reconstructed man is a slightly better bet between the sheets. The whole presentation of the male body package will be underplayed and neat. No showy boxer shorts with a peeled banana printed on the front here. Either a designer jockstrap in black or grey, or instant nudity with no hang-ups. Now, if by any chance you're the sort of person who likes to have an affair with a married man, then a reconstructed one is by far the best bet. Donald Laycock, the architect we met earlier, explains how he has affairs.
Well, when I'm having an affair, I see it as a simple friendship built round a leisure or sporting pursuit. I have affairs in much the same way other people play golf with each other. Now, my wife isn't interested in golf, so I'm sure she wouldn't be interested in my other activities.
Now, when or if the excitement finally leaves the illicit affair, a woman will find a reconstructed man has an excellent attitude. Gerald Milligan believes this is yet to be portrayed in our popular culture.
I just did not understand the movie Fatal Attraction. And I never would have slept with Glenn Close without using an adequate method of barrier contraception. And then if she had become pregnant, she probably would have become a close family friend. And as an affirmation of the trust my wife and I felt for Glenn, when we went on vacation, she could look after the rabbit.
Now, do reconstructed men have any effect on society as a whole? Well, a questionnaire was developed by the United Nations during International Women's Year and was filled in by 7 million men worldwide. The results have now been correlated. We can see here in this diagram the effects these ideas have had on an international stage. Unfortunately, due to the technical limitations of the printing process, the line depicting aware males is far too thick. So, is it really worth all the bother? Some intellectuals amongst you might argue that the difference between a reconstructed and unreconstructed man would be impossible to measure. So I decided to ask someone who's worked in the field of relationships between men and women for many years, the renowned American writer and polemicist John D. Speffendaffer, author of the best-selling book Men Who Like Women for About 10 Minutes Then Get All Iffy and Run Off Without Explanation, what he thought about the influence of the reconstructed man. He said, "Hey Bob, just accept it. Guys like to ball, okay, and chicks like security. So you've got a basic conflict which keeps people like us in a job. Don't knock it, man." So what conclusion can we draw? Is there any point in men even trying to change? Has all the soul-searching, pontificating and publishing of the last 20 years been in vain? Well, first, I asked John Blake, the biochemist from Essex, if he thought men had changed at all in the last 20 years.
Look, ladies like being ladies, and blokes are blokes. No one wants to change. It was so much simpler before you and your lot started messing around with it. It's got so complicated now, I don't know where I stand anymore. Tell a joke in a pub, get your head bitten off. Most ladies don't know how lucky they are. Look, I am as considerate as the next man. But I don't understand it. How come you're so bloody popular, eh? What are they seeing you? Smug git.
Then I asked Peter Bradshaw how his life had changed over the last 20 years.
Well, in the 70s, I tried to be open. In the 80s, I tried to be honest. And in the 90s, I'm going to kick some ass.
Well, I'm sure I don't have to explain to you that Peter is on a long and difficult journey of personal growth, as am I. Well, it's come to that point in the evening now where I'd like to open up the discussion onto a far wider footing. So if there's anybody here who feels they would like to ask a question, well, please do feel free within what I'm sure is a very, very supportive environment. Yes, the woman in the glasses.
Do you consider yourself to be a reconstructed man?
That's a very interesting question, as it highlights the dilemma that many men find themselves in. Due to the fact that the act of claiming to be reconstructed would be a social stance or a pose, which by definition would be very unreconstructed behavior, then I would have to answer, no, I'm not. Are there any other questions? Right up at the back.
Are you single?
This is... single is a very difficult state to define, I think. Obviously a very flattering question. I'm very pleased you asked. Thank you. I'll deal with that internally in my own way later. Yes?
Do you think women are really concerned with male penis size?
Well, this is a subject which has obviously obsessed men for many years, and I have occasionally a sneaking suspicion it doesn't interest women to quite the same extent. No, I don't think that women are particularly interested, although I feel that one could actually draw a graph of the level of interest that women have in the size of the male penis, and I think it would have fluctuated over the years. I think in the mid-70s, women were totally disinterested in anything to do with a penetrative organ. And during the mid-80s, there was a kind of reaction to that, and a lot of women said, you know, yes, I'd like a big one. Any other questions? Yes, on the end of the row here.
Well, in the early 80s, in the back of Time Out, you could see adverts for genital balancing weekends. Did you ever go on one of these? And what went on?
Yes, a genital balancing weekend, for those of you who don't know, was really a way that men found to deal with the whole issue of penis size. I can't think of a nicer way of saying it. There was a tremendous amount of discussion about whether penises needed to be bigger or smaller, and it was a rather sad discussion that went on for years and years and years, and still goes on, obviously, with each new generation of men that realise that theirs is the smallest that's ever happened. So the genital balancing weekend was often a time which men spent in either a teepee or a sweat lodge for many hours, with nothing on, obviously, just looking at themselves and going, it's fine, I can cope with it, there's nothing else I can do, that's it, that's all I've got, and I'll live with it, you know. But they were great weekends. I had really good fun doing it. Any other questions coming up? The woman in the glasses there.
Is there such a thing as a reconstructed woman?
Well, this is a very interesting question because, in fact, I've been writing a lecture on this subject for the last year. Yes, I do believe there is such a thing as a reconstructed woman. I've been working on this, and I've so far written 2 lines, and after an experience last night, I crossed them both out this morning. There is, in fact, one question which I get asked more than any other. People, and by people I mean women, want to know if this whole lecture is one of the biggest and most elaborate pick-up routines ever attempted or witnessed. Well, I'd just like to say that I'm already involved in a very committed and fulfilling relationship of my own. Well, when I say my own, I mean it's our shared relationship to which I bring my own feelings and my own responsibilities without swamping hers. Anyway, I'm not looking for any form of sexual activity outside that partnership. That is not to say that I find the prospect of the possibility of something happening uninteresting. Far from it. It's just that I choose not to get involved at this point in time. Of course, we're all human. I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed of. I'm not ashamed to say that I find some of the women in this audience tonight deeply, deeply attractive. It's just that I choose to do nothing about these very, very strong desires. Well, because I hope I've explained to you what men are trying, really trying to do. Perhaps if my perception has shown me anything, it is how to get to the very reconstructed heart. It's a big heart. It's a big, loving, expansive heart. And like Martin Luther King or Gandhi, this heart is involved in an epic, difficult, and lonely struggle. It's a struggle few men undertake and many ridicule. But just occasionally, someone will reach out in the dark and lend a helping hand. And if you allow yourself to be drawn into the heart of reconstruction, you will find honesty. The further in you go, the more honesty you will feel. More and more honesty until you hear the heartbeat. And that is when you will discover truth. Maybe not all truths, or only certain truths, but most importantly of all, you will find your truth. Thank you very much indeed. No, I'm not going to make it back tonight. I've missed the last train. It's fine. No, I'll stay at the office. It's no problem. You know I do. Well, you know, I don't need to tell you. All right, I'll tell you. I love you, okay? Yeah, all right. Yeah, I know you were projecting, darling. It's okay. Don't worry. Don't worry. Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye. See you tomorrow. Yeah. Boo-boo. Boo-boo-boo. Boo-boo-boo-boo-boo. Boo-boo-boo. Okay. Bye. Bye. Right. So, what do you fancy? A club or we can go out for a meal? I'm easy. I don't mind.